Okay, the lights are set up inside the scene. The next thing we want to do, right before we get to the global illumination, is we actually want to turn some exposure values on in the scene so we can take down some of the hot spots on these lights. So 8 on the keyboard for your environment and effects window. And inside your environments, we set our background color to white. That's going to be just fine. Our global lighting, because we're not going to be bouncing any light off from an FG sky dome or anything, so we're just going to leave it with global lighting right now, set to the white. And our exposure controls right in here, let's go ahead and drop this to our mental ray photographic exposure control. We'll turn that one on. And like we looked at before, you've got some preset options in here if you want to set those. We're going to go ahead and change it from photographic exposure because we don't really want to deal with each one of these settings. We could, but just for ease, we're going to go to the exposure value, our EV. If you remember, the lower you go with this number, the brighter your scene gets, the higher, the darker. So we're going to take this from 15, we're going to bump this to about a 10. We're going to leave our highlights and our shadows pretty close to this. Let's go ahead and just bump one of these values down just a little bit. We could take this to about a 25. Go 25 and 25 for both. We may be adjusting our curve just a little bit more. Now the other thing that we want to look at, and it's one of those options that you really need to remember, is that when you're actually setting that exposure control, we'll take a quick render of it just so that we can see what actually happens to us. It's going to go thinking through all of this, and when it starts rendering it out, it's not going to give us quite what we want. You can see in here it's going through all the calculations, it's doing what it's supposed to do, but there's just little teeny tiny spots here and there. There's not even all that much for us to really see inside of the scene. We'll go ahead and cancel that out right now. And why is it doing that? It's because our physical scale that we're using right now. We're using a physical units, and what we want to do is just do a unitless method. We want to set the actual value for the lights instead of using physical lights. And we'll bump this down just about 1,000. And the gamma right now is disabled. We'll take a render of it and see if we actually need to increase that gamma value or not. We may increase that more towards the end when we see the final render. So go ahead and render this out. Okay, with the exposure value turned on, we can see that we've really toned out a lot of that high, those hot spots here and there inside the scene. It's gotten a nice, more even, more control in the scene and a more even set for the lighting in there. It's looking really good like that. Okay, now what we want to do with our exposure value turned on, we simply want to move into actually turning on global illumination and seeing where we're at with the GI. So we're going to go into our render setup window. Go ahead and close this one out. And let's just go to our render setup window, and inside the render setup window we'll go to our indirect illumination tab, and we're going to go to our caustics and global illumination rollout. Inside of here we're simply wanting just to turn this on. We'll enable this guy. We'll leave our multiplier at 1.0. The maximum number of photons per sample, this is our photon accuracy that we want to work with. We're eventually going to work this up to about 3,000 or 4,000. For right now, we'll just bump it up to about 2,000. It's really not going to affect your render speed in any way. The other options we have here, we've got the maximum sampling radius. By default, it's turned off. It's saying, max is going to handle the sizing of this to create that sampling radius. We're going to leave it on default for right now. The other option we have again is that optimize for final gather. We haven't turned on final gather yet, so we're not going to use that option just yet. Now the other thing we want to do, we want to go ahead and go back to our lights with that turned on, and we want to increase our photons. We'll go ahead and take a render at default for right now and see what we've got. Right now we've got, let's see, our lights are actually on the automatic, so they're about 20,000. Let's go ahead and just turn this one on. Let's turn this guy on over here. So we're just setting them to our manual settings in our indirect illumination rollout. Right now our energy is up really high on both, and our GI photons are down really low. So if we take a render of this, let's see what we get. We'll probably get a scene that's very blown out. Okay, inside the scene we can see that we've got way too much energy in here. It's way too bright. It's almost losing any of the contrast that we want inside of it. A lot of splotching all over the place. This is because we need more photons. We need more GI photons inside the scene. We need to bump that energy down so that we're not losing out on some of these good details that we want. So let's go ahead and go to each light. Let's take this to, instead of about the 100,000, let's set it at 200,000. And with our energy from our light, let's just cut this almost in half. We'll go about 26,000. And let's select on our other light. The other thing we want to do too while we're in here, with our ray trace shadows, we're going to drop off at two-sided to speed up rendering while we're just iterating on this. And on our lighting in here, again, we'll bump this to about the 26,000. We'll take our GI photons up to 200,000. This way we're just throwing more photons out in the scene, smoothing it up. And again, we would have to take this up to millions and millions if we were just doing this with the GI. We know we're going to be using the final gather, and that's going to smooth out some of the splotching that we might still see inside the scene. Now with those lights set up, let's go ahead and re-render this. Okay, after the render, it looks like we're doing pretty good. We've cleaned up a lot of that splotching inside of the scene, so much so that we could probably even bump the number of photons down inside of the scene and not have to worry about it that much. But because we're going to be reusing it, then we're not really going to worry that much about it. So let's go into our render setup window, into our reuse FG and GI, and we're going to be turning this one on. We're going to go down to our Caustics Global Illumination. We're going to do a read-write photons to the map file. We're going to go on and let's go ahead and go into our file here. We're just going to call this our scene GI map. We'll save that one out. And let's go ahead and just generate the photon map file for right now. We could do it at the first time of the render, but we'll go ahead and just generate it from here. And all that's going to do is process it. It's not actually going to render out the scene for us, just going to process that information. And this is just going to speed up the overall process. Instead of having to do all those calculations for the photon emissions, it's just going to jump right into the rendering instead. You see here it's calculating. It's going pretty quick too. It's not going to take all that long to get that rendered out. Alright, fantastic. That gave us our photon map. If we go back to the directory in here, we can see we've got our map. We're only at about 8 megs, so it's not even all that bad of a file. Go ahead and cancel that out. If that were actually a higher file, then one of the options we do have with the global illumination is to go in and make some adjustments on our merge nearby photons to save the memory. We're not going to be doing any kind of networking with this, sending it to any render farms, so we're not going to mess with that one. Now the other option we have in here, because right now we're letting Max do the calculations on our scene, and we do, if we want to take some of that control, if we want to not have Max mysteriously just handle all of that for us, we could go in, we can actually make the adjustment in here, and this is where we're going to create our own sampling radius. How large is that radius going to be to make those samples? So right now it's set to a 1 by default. You could take it to about a 3 or 2 with this environment, and it would work pretty good for you. Okay, with those parameters set up, and with our render looking pretty nice right now. Some of those areas are looking better. Our details around the shadows, we're getting some ugly spots in here. We've got some ugly areas, lack of definition underneath, not very, sharp on some of those areas. That's where the final gather is going to come. It's going to help us get some of those corners back. It's going to help us get some of that definition in the shadows back, and that's what we're going to want to work on next. With the global illumination set up right now, we can go ahead and call that one a done deal. And next up, we'll move into the final gather